Due to isolation from Western influence for over 200 years, Japan was able to establish and nurture a unique cultural and ideological identity that, when introduced to the ideas of Christianity from a Western perspective, allowed them to critique the ideology and existential concepts in a way that the West could not or would not, due to Christianity not being a foundational aspect of Japanese life. We study history because we are shaped by it. Human progress leaves a trail. Major events trigger a multitude of effects across the entire globe and become such universal knowledge that people often can't remember how or why things started. These stories have been retold, repurposed, rewritten, and revised by people in positions of power for thousands of years. One of these old stories in human history still dominates public life to this day: the story of Jesus of Nazareth. Me explaining the story of Jesus to a class of MCS majors would be like the new Batman movie showing Bruce and his parents going to see Mask of Zorro. Yeah, we know what happens. How did a small subsection of an already small group of people, led by a quote-unquote radical leader, become such a political powerhouse and the most popular religion in the world? Well, all it took was a little convincing. Early Catholic ministry began by Jesus' 12 apostles after Jesus' crucifixion, and shortly thereafter by St. Paul. Jerusalem was incorporated into the Roman Empire by their desire to control the entire Mediterranean coastline. In 380, Theodosius decreed Christianity would now be Rome's state religion until the fall of Rome in 476, and the eastern remains of the Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire maintained its Roman identity along with their Christianity. The western half of Europe was directionless, with no single state having the ability to conquer the whole territory. However, the Catholic Church still held power in the western remnants of a fallen empire. The Catholic Church had attempted to expand their power and territory out east through a myriad of crusades, justifying them by selling it as a reclaiming the Holy Land for the one true Church of God. But the Crusades failed and never passed the Zagros Mountains in modern-day Iran. The Church's march across the world was stopped at this impassable mountain range, as the only seafaring route to reach Asia at the time was to make the untenable journey around the entire continent of Africa. Christianity had, for all of Europe was concerned, conquered the world. But contrary to Eurocentric thought, Christianity had not shed its light on all of God's children. Not in the land of the rising sun. Japan for hundreds of years was constantly embroiled in civil war among feuding warlords, also known as daimyos, fighting to gain more territory and resources. There was no actual functioning central government in Japan. There was an emperor, but they were more symbolic while still being lavished with royal treatment. In 1603, when Tokugawa unified Japan, Tokugawa instituted an isolationist policy for Japan. This isolation from the West lasted until 1853, when American naval Commodore Matthew Perry took his 4 ships into the Tokyo Bay. Prior to this, Japan had extremely limited contact with the West. Trade was almost exclusively done with the Dutch at the port city of Nagasaki. This was Japan's approach to global politics for over 200 years. And the only reason it took this long was for the West to develop the technology or create relationships capable of allowing them to bridge those geographic boundaries that isolated Japan for those 200 years. Religion and spirituality in Japan are treated with less levity than it traditionally is in the West. The 2 major religions of Japan at the time were Buddhism and Shinto. Neither one of these are monotheistic or require the amount of surrender to the faith that Christian dogma calls for. Buddhism looks to free oneself from worldly attachments, and Shinto believes in the spirit imbued in all things. Christianity are not the religious ideals that align with the history of a country shaped by feudalism and war. The cultural identity was firmly established by 1853. The fundamental idea behind Christianity just doesn't fit with Japanese life. When the West did arrive, Japan took what it needed and left what it did not. Japan did not have the infrastructure to develop 19th and 20th century industry. With the beginning of the Meiji era, however, Japan's industry exploded. Mitsubishi began as a shipping company in 1870, and then began to develop all sorts of domestic industrial goods, as well as bolstering Japan's military up to the modern standards. It is because of Japan's domestic industrial boom that kept them free from reliance on Western imports. While Japan was no longer isolated, it remained independent. Now, Japan is a major exporting nation, and its culture has been embraced worldwide through anime, manga, J-pop, and video games, and they have become staples in American pop culture. The focus of this study is how Japan's cultural identity portrays the Western ideology of Christianity. Does Japan's antithetical worldview allow their media to critique Christianity in a way Western media cannot? I intend to analyze several pieces of Japanese media using a semiotic approach, analyzing the religious symbols and themes used as methods to shape their narratives, often turning these symbols on their head. Semiotics and semiology can be defined as the study of symbols. Symbols are like ogres.
Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers? You get it. We both have layers.
Symbols have denotations and connotations. A stop sign's denotation is stop. Its connotation says the other drivers get to go. It means that if you do not stop, you may get into an accident. If you do not stop, you may get pulled over. The stop sign does not explicitly say that those might happen, but we all understand that that is what it means. I will be utilizing semiotics and when doing content analysis of several integral pieces of modern Japanese media while framing the perspective through the lens of Japanese cultural identity. Let's begin with a piece of media that utilized the narrative structure of the story of Jesus. Hunter x Hunter is one of the most popular and critically acclaimed manga and anime of all time. The story of a boy looking for his father that unfolds into an ensemble story on a massive scale. One of the most antagonistic forces is Crollo the Silver and the Phantom Troop. There are several parallels between Crollo and the Troop and the story of Jesus. Crollo and the Troop are from Meteor City, a place that is not even officially on a map. The Phantom Troop has 13 members, Crollo and his 12 followers. Each member has a tattoo of a spider with a number on it. The back of Crollo's jacket has an upside-down cross, also known as a St. Peter's cross. Crollo's power comes from his book, and the motto of the troop is "The Spider Survives." Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew 5:5. Jesus was born of humble beginnings and made his living as a carpenter. Bethlehem was a blip on the radar, and Nazareth wasn't a sprawling metropolis either. Jesus suffered and died by crucifixion, which has become the primary symbol for Christianity. Jesus knew he was going to die, but he knew that as long as the Word of God was to be recorded in the Bible, then his teachings and the faith would survive. However, the Phantom Troop are a group of unapologetic thieves and brutal murderers. Their target in the show is the Mafia, but they also slaughtered Kurapika's entire family. But their bond to each other and to the teachings of Crollo and the laws of the troop are unquestioned throughout the entire series. The spider must survive. The moral spinning of Jesus and his apostles and their acts highlights the destruction that happens often when Christianity lands upon new shores. Much like the troop forced its will on any of its targets, Western colonial occupation forced their way of life, including Christianity, onto its occupants. Neon Genesis Evangelion, when translated literally, means a new gospel. The show takes place in Japan in an alternate reality where an angel crashed down onto Earth and caused the second impact, and wipe out a third of life on Earth. The protagonist is Shinji Ikari. Shinji is a very insecure, neurotic, and anxious 15-year-old boy who is tasked with being one of 3 pilots for mankind's best defense against the angels, the Evas. The Evas are biomechanical robots developed by the secret military group NERV that is operated by Gendo Ikari, Shinji's father. Evas specifically can only be piloted by someone who is 15 years of age. The Evas are also made from fallen angels and have the souls of the pilot mothers bound inside of each one. In Shinto, it is possible for anything to have a spirit or kami to represent something. There are many gods for many things, but the concept of a god in Japanese culture is understood differently there than it would be in Western culture. Kami are more like spirits that exist in a different side of the world in the way that a coin has 2 sides. The Evas and their pilots represent and literally embody Shinto in 2 ways. The kami of each Eva is the mother of its pilot until the pilot becomes the corporeal kami to the Eva. Representing the Evas as kami would signify Shinto and Japanese spirituality, fighting against the destructive force of the angels. There is a gap in the documentation of Jesus' life from the ages of 12 to 30. When he was 12, Jesus went missing, and Mary and Joseph found him at the temple, listening to the teachers and announcing his presence as the Son of God. The recording of Jesus' life and public works begins at the age of 30 with his baptism in the River Jordan by his cousin, John the Baptist. That 18-year gap is referred to as the hidden years. According to Catholic dogma, Jesus is all man and all God. What would go through a human's head, realizing that the power of God and the weight of the world rest on their shoulders? What would a teenager do while trying to comprehend who they are or even what they are? Shinji is 15 and at the absolute height of hormonal puberty, while being asked by his father to pilot humanity's best weapon to defend itself from aliens capable of causing a world-ending event. Shinji is a reluctant savior that is common in Japanese manga, particularly in the shonen archetype. When Shinji's father asked to save the world, he didn't have an 18-year period to learn how to do it. Gendo Ikari makes me think of the famous verse, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. I can understand Gendo Ikari, but I've never liked Gendo Ikari. He didn't care about Shinji when he gave the world his son. Shinji's abandonment issues are at the heart of his character. Shinji's father created a man-made fleet of angels ready to defend his people as long as his son leads the way. Final Fantasy Tactics is critical of the power structure that the Church has established in the political landscape. The puppeteers of the Lion's War are clergy from inside the Church of Glabados, with aspirations to overthrow the current feudalism power structure and create a unified theocratic state. The Church of Glabados and its dogma are almost a carbon copy of the Catholic Church in dogma. It would be a fair comparison to say one would be Greek mythological canon, and the other would be Roman mythological canon. Their deity is Saint Ajora and her 12 Zodiac Braves who were sent by God to save all of Avalis. The motive and methods of the Church's quest for power became so unrelenting that the worldly goods and affairs would not be able to satisfy their thirst for power. The Zodiac Stones are thought to contain the power of the Zodiac Braves, but they actually possess demon spirits and lose all regard for human life. What makes these characters so evil is not that they are members of the Church, but that they are abusing the faith of the people for selfish gains. Mark Filipowicz summarizes this point in his piece Faith in Final Fantasy Tactics in a more ideological perspective. Though many members of the Church are antagonists, religion is not a figure of villainy for villainy sake. The villains of Final Fantasy Tactics are villains because they're misrepresenting God. The main character of Final Fantasy Tactics is Ramza Beolve. The Beolve family is a long-standing house of nobility and knighthood. Ramza's father, Balbanes, was a hero that was integral to the ending of the 50 Years' War that took place prior to the events of the game. Ramza had two older half-brothers named Dystarg and Zalbag, who hold high political power and high military command, respectively. Ramza was a cadet in the military until his brother Zalbag killed Teta, who was the younger sister of Ramza's best friend and partner, Delida. Ramza became disillusioned with the military and noble life, so he renounced his title and joined a band of mercenaries, only to find out that their leader is connected to the Church, who is manipulating both sides of the Lion's War. Ramza fought back against the corruption, and he was branded a heretic as a result. Ramza holds true to the pride and virtues that people believe the Beolve name to represent. The Beolve name represents for truth and justice. It is not a tool to be used for selfish gain. My Lord Father fought and died defending our people against Ordalia in the 50 Years' War. House Beolve cannot now turn on its purpose and fight for the interests of a corrupt crown and a self-serving aristocracy. Ramza Beolve to Islud Tengio. Ramza in this regard exhibits several parallels to Jesus as well. Both were branded as heretics, as well as actively tried to reform the system in which they existed. But primarily, the sense of morality and justice that Ramza shows throughout the game is one of the most genuine representations of a virtuous hero I have ever seen. These traits of Ramza are flipped by his former partner, Delida, who is using moral means to work to the end of the war, such as kidnapping and murder, as Delida lost all faith in people and power. At the end of the game, Ramsa discovers that Saint Majora is actually the malevolent force at the heart of it all, and literally kills God. Delida tore down the power construct, and became king to reap the benefits of.
This proposal barely scratches the surface of examples and even the depths of the ones presented here. Once Western culture reached the shores of the land of the rising sun and the Meiji era began, a new style of Western government and Western fashion and some Western culture were imported and adopted, so exposure to Christianity became inevitable. However, style and administration is not something that is fundamentally against the ideology of your people, where faith lives in the mind and rests in the heart. To fully explore this topic, I must expand more on how Christianity affected Western culture, how Christianity was spread and what method of spreading Christianity they used, and the adoption of the rest of Western culture. There are also more examples in different media that I would like to expand more on. This study also has to account for cultural hybridity and globalization, as the Castlevania Netflix series is produced in America, and anime like Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo are heavily influenced by Western culture. This study is also limited by the amount of hard data that can be collected. Most of the analysis will be based in semiotic theory and speculation, and will have difficulty finding any quantitative data for support. I acknowledge that this study is being conducted by a disillusioned, recovering Catholic, and that while it gives me insight into the themes and symbols, it also produces biases because of certain connections that I have through my experience of my worldview. I would like to challenge my bias by exploring more Japanese media and Christian representation to get more insight into the Japanese worldview as well as dive into Japanese philosophy. Japan has largely been a self-sustaining nation, but Western colonialism was impossible to avoid. I would like to end on a quote from Dave Chappelle that I will leave the clip for context. But when Christianity came, Japan asked, "What do we need you for?"
HBO Max is streaming it too. I'll tell you another story about HBO. No, hear me out. Did you know, before Chappelle's show was at Comedy Central, I pitched that show to HBO. I told them what I wanted to do. Now, these are executives. All they have to do is say, yeah, we'll take it, or no, thank you, we won't. But they didn't say either of those things. They went too far. They said, literally, what do we need you for? That's what they told me, as they kicked me out of the office. What do we need you for? And here we are, all these years later, and they're streaming the very show that I was pitching to them. So I'm asking them, what do you need